January 22, 1943. A 27-year-old lieutenant crouches in a destroyed bunker. Watching Japanese snipers through a scope, his own officers called a toy. In the past 72 hours, enemy snipers killed 14 Americans. His commanders gave him one warning to prove his mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. What happened next changed how the U.S. Army thought about snipers forever. Welcome to History of World War II, where we uncover the forgotten stories that changed the course of history. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history every single week. Before we dive into John George's incredible story, do me a quick favor, tap that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this forgotten hero story with more people. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. Second Lieutenant John George had a problem. Actually, he had several problems, but they all stemmed from one thing: his rifle. When George unpacked his Winchester Model 70 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer actually laughed. "Is this for deer or Germans?" he asked, holding up the civilian hunting rifle like it was a child's toy. George explained calmly, "Neither. It's for the Japanese." The rifle had cost George 2 years of National Guard pay. Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope, the kind of precision instrument that won him the Illinois State Championship in 1939. At just 23 years old, he'd been the youngest winner in state history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With his scope, he could put 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. But the U.S. Army didn't care about state championships. They cared about the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle issued to every soldier. 9.5 pounds of American steel. 8-round clip, no magnification needed. George's Winchester. 9 pounds plus 12 ounces for the scope. Bolt action, only 5 rounds. And worst of all, it looked like something a weekend hunter would take after white-tailed deer in the Illinois woods. The other platoon leaders had a name for it: his mail-order sweetheart. Captain Morris was less poetic. He called it what he thought it was: useless. Leave the sporting rifle in your tent, Lieutenant. Carry a real weapon. Here's the thing nobody understood. George wasn't trying to be different. He was trying to survive. And in the jungles of Guadalcanal, where Japanese snipers were killing Americans from trees 90 feet up and 200 yards away, George knew something his fellow officers didn't. Distance saves lives. But first, he had to get his rifle to the battlefield. They shipped out before the Winchester arrived. George spent the entire voyage across the Pacific watching other men clean their grounds, while his precision rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He filed a request through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. George carried that rifle anyway. Orders or no orders. By late December 1942, the 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal. The Marines had taken Henderson Field after months of brutal fighting. They'd held it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanaku River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese had fortified it with 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. For 16 days, they fought through hell. 34 men killed. 279 wounded. When they finally took the western slope on January 2nd, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The mockery continued. But in the Point Cruz groves, everything was about to change. The jungle around Point Cruz was different from Mount Austin. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just massive banyan trees, some reaching 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick, and Japanese soldiers who retreated west from Henderson Field and disappeared into the canopy. Some of those soldiers were snipers, professional snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. Men who knew the jungle better than any American ever would. On January 19th, they killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, 2 men from L Company died during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more Americans fell. One was shot through the neck from a tree his patrol had walked past twice. In 72 hours, Japanese snipers killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. The battalion commander summoned George that night. His tone had changed. The mockery was gone. Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria, and he needed someone who could actually shoot back. "Does that mail-order rifle of yours actually hit anything, Lieutenant?" George recited his credentials. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with his Lyman Alaskan scope. 27 years old. 0 confirmed kills. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. Here's what I want you to think about. Would you trust your life to a weapon everyone else called a toy? Drop your answer in the comments. This story gets absolutely incredible from here. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now. You're about to see why John George became a legend. And keep that like button pressed. January 22nd, 1943, 9:17 a.m. George had been glassing the jungle for hours from the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. He brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of KI. And 60 rounds of KI-26 hunting ammunition in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan scope had only 2.5 power magnification, but enough to see what the naked eye would miss. Then he saw it. A branch moved. No wind. Just a small shift, 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met, facing east toward the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope to clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester S-trigger broke clean at 3.5 pounds, exactly how he deset it at Camp Perry before the war. He squeezed. The Winchester cracked. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell, tumbling 90 feet through the branches, his body hitting the ground with a sound George would never forget. His first kill? George worked the bolt smoothly. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree, waiting. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. The spotter had to be close. At 9:43 a.m., George found him. Different tree, 60 yards north, maybe 50 feet up. This sniper was moving down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot. He knew his position was compromised. George led the movement and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. Then at 11:21 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. A third sniper, someone George hadn't seen, had found him. George rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The hunter had become the hunted. For 3 minutes, George waited. When he finally inched back to his firing position, he glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved. That was basic sniper doctrine. But in jungle, this dense relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 173 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. Mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers, 5 shots fired, 5 men dead. Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. Men who had mocked his mail-order sweetheart now wanted to watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was completely gone from his voice. "Be back in position at dawn, Lieutenant." January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor to mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in his bunker and waited. The rain stopped at 8:15 a.m. By 8:45, visibility had returned. At 9:12 a.m., George spotted the first sniper of the day. This one was smart, using the rain to mask his approach. George fired. The 6th kill. But then, mortar rained down. They'd found his position. He grabbed his rifle and ran, diving into a crater just as his bunker exploded. Relocating, he spent the rest of the day hunting. By 5 p.m., he had 2 more kills. The score was 12 rounds fired, 8 kills. 8 of the 11 enemy snipers were gone. 3 remained, the best ones, and they knew who they were hunting. The next morning, George spotted sniper number 9. The position was too obvious, too easy. 'Twas bait. He scanned the area and found the real threat hidden in a nearby tree, waiting. George made his move. He shot the decoy, then immediately swung his rifle and fired again, taking out the real sniper just as he reacted. 10 confirmed kills. 1 left to go. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. Quick question. If you were George right now, would you keep hunting or pull back? Think about it. 10 kills, 1 left, but that last one knows every trick you have. What would you do? George relocated again, this time to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. He settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed glassing trees. At 9:47 a.m., George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. The Japanese sniper was crawling through the jungle floor vegetation, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover. He was hunting George the way George had been hunting him. George remained motionless in the water. The Winchester was already shouldered, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot, and rising would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped at 9:52, just 40 yards from the rocks. He was studying George's last known position, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the same side George had used when evacuating under machine gun fire. The Japanese sniper had watched. He'd learned George's patterns. The sniper reached the rocks and took up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, exactly where George should have relocated. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards. Easy, even without a scope. But George hesitated again. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations. He'd outlived 10 other snipers who died because they made mistakes. This man wouldn't make mistakes. George kept his scope on the sniper, but expanded his awareness. At 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch. 2 men working together. The final 2 snipers. George couldn't shoot both before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate and return fire. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep. George rose from the water. Slowly, silently, he brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from everything: the barrel, his uniform, his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 4 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves. But as George climbed out of the crater to retrieve his spent cartridges, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Japanese voices grew louder, at least 6 men, maybe more. Infantry, a patrol or recovery team sent to collect bodies. At 10:28, the voices began moving toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester. At least 6 Japanese soldiers. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. George climbed out on the north side and ran. He sprinted 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Bullets struck around the crater, around his cover. George aimed at movement 50 yards out and fired. The lead soldier dropped. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. George made his decision. He could untwin a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatics. He needed to break contact. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him, bullets snapping past, striking trees, kicking up dirt. After 90 seconds, George dove into another shell crater and pressed himself against the wall. The Japanese voices were distant now. They weren't pursuing. They were regrouping around their dead. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself and was led through. At battalion headquarters, Captain Morris wanted a full debrief. George reported 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, 12 rounds fired against snipers, 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills, 5 rounds total in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. If this story moved you the way it moved me, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show John George's story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we re-rescuing forgotten stories like this from dusty archives every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community stretches across the entire world. If you're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. But John George's war wasn't over. The next day, division headquarters had a question. Could George train other men to do what he'd done? George said yes, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Division had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, sniper rifles left behind by Marines. They had 40 men who'd qualified as expert marksmen. George created a sniper section. Training began on January 27th. By February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Over the next week, his sniper section killed 74 Japanese soldiers with 0 American casualties. On February 7th, a Japanese rifleman shot George in the left shoulder. The wound was serious, but not fatal. Doctors said he'd recover but needed rest, no combat operations for at least 3 weeks. While George recovered, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. But new orders arrived. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a classified mission in Burma. George volunteered. His Winchester Model 70 went with him, packed in a waterproof case. By April 1944, George had joined a new unit, minus 3,000 men total. They had no official designation yet. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. George S. Battalion entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission advanced through terrain the Japanese considered impassable and capture Muchina airfield. Over 3 months, the Marauders covered 700 miles through mountains and jungle. George used his Winchester 7 times. Always one shot, always a kill, always moving immediately afterward. By May, the Marauders had accomplished their mission, but the cost was severe. The unit entered Burma with 3,000 men. Disease killed more than combat. George survived, but the campaign proved something he'd begun to suspect on Guadalcanal. Modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles were becoming standard. The individual marksman with a precision rifle was becoming obsolete. George returned to the United States in July 1944, promoted to captain, assigned to training duties at Fort Benning. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. After the war, George attended Princeton on the GI Bill, then Oxford, eventually settling in Washington, D.C., working on African affairs for the State Department. In 1947, George wrote down what happened, not for publication, just his own record. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association convinced him to publish. The book became a classic, Shots Fired in Anger. It's still in print today. Still used by firearms enthusiasts and military historians. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 93 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. But it's not. It sat the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could undo it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. Thank you for watching History of World War II. And thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated like George was? Have you ever proven the doubters wrong? Share your story. We'll see you in the next one with another forgotten hero from the greatest generation.